I intended to do a sermon coming back from the Feast of Tabernacles, and this was it. It was expanding the economic woes and entering into the second year of lean. Now, you might be familiar with the graphics of this design of the sermon because actually it's a carry-through for a sermon that we did earlier in the year of the first year of lean. So I thought it appropriate to do this. And I began working on it right before the Feast of Tabernacles with the intent of doing that first sermon when we got off the boat and came back the following Sabbath, because that would actually be our first sermon following atonement, which actually led us into a new cycle, our new Shemitah year, or cycle is we're going into. This would be our second year. But of course, as you know, while we were on the boat, the last great day, Israel was attacked and war had begun. And because of the significance of that event, I put this off. And carrying that through and through all the series that we had to get through to complete it, I wanted to go back and take care of this. I think it's actually more important now than I was going to do 2 months ago. And I'm going to show you why. Is in the years that I've been doing sermons, I remember I would begin following the principle of the Bible, said all scripture is given for, for reproof, for instruction, and all that, and you go through. And when you do a sermon, you think of at the time of the year, of course, you would do a sermon on holy days during the meat-induced season, or if you want to do something that would be uplifting or encouraging. All those things were important, but in 2015, things changed. And I felt the commissions God's given me and some of the understanding that I've been receiving, been actually following a path of cycles and time. And so each sermon I give seems to follow a pattern, walking us through step by step as if we're on our journey to the return of Jesus Christ. And indeed, I think we are. I won't go to that extreme to say, yeah, we are for sure, but it certainly feels that way. And when you follow the scriptures and the sermons and the series we've been doing, you would come to almost the same agreement in that fashion. So let me show you what I'm talking about with this. Is that last year, I began speaking a lot about the seals of Revelation. And of course, when we came back in from the Feast of Tabernacles, of course, we went into what we believe was the second seal. So during the course of the year, the series that I began before the Feast of Tabernacles, it was called, if you can see that up on the screen, Approaching the Second Seal. All last year, everything we looked at, all the events, it began leading up to greater escalation in war. Of course, that was the next cycle in our 7-year cycle, it was war. And of course, that was also the cycle of the second seal. So it was obvious that what we were looking at, we were moving into that phase, and we actually, what we believe was the first seal last year was seal P27, and the Pope being involved actually laid the foundation for where we were going to the second seal, never knowing exactly when we think it might start, but all the events was leading to that. So you with me on that? So that was through the last year. So in other words, we're marching step by step, following the patterns of the Bible, following the cycles as we understand, and we watch everything and it moves us through, and eventually you begin to see things are happening. So then, October, war began. There was no way of knowing that before we went to the Feast of Tabernacles that event was going to take place. In fact, you look at all the leaders around the world who are supposedly studying what's taking place, they were all caught flat-footed. And it was happening. So in October, what we believed, and we've laid out in the past series now, that we believe that was actually the opening of the second seal. The opening of the second seal doesn't conclude the second seal. It only opens and it pushes this down to a conclusion. I was talking to an elder in the church yesterday, and I was explaining to him, I said, all these things that are taking place, they don't give us the end. We know the end. We know Christ is coming back. We don't know when. But I tell you what God's doing for us, and I hope you can draw great confidence, is God showing us the beginning. In other words, he's telling us where you are right now so that you have the opportunity to take advantage of the time you live in to prepare for what's coming. We don't know how long it's going to be for sure. We don't know the day or the hour, but we know we're here now. Just like we believe with the blood moon tetrads, that was the beginning of God ushering in the end of the time for the return of Jesus Christ. And indeed, everything now coming to pass, that more and more of the people in Protestant churches as well are saying, look, this looks like we're getting close to the return of Christ. So all of these things are leading up to that. So now, we looked at these two things. But I went back even further into last year. And when I went to that, I went all the way back to December of 2022. And we began as we were going through our journey. And I'm going to call that our journey, the pathway, the map that God's put us on. As far back now as December 22nd. And I began speaking about the seals of Revelation. Because indeed, everything that I was reading, what I could understand from Scripture, what I was understanding from prophecies, certain events, and the time sequences of everything was pushing us to the time that we're moving to the time of the seals. And as you will see today, as the sermon I'm putting together, I pulled in pieces from various sermons over the last year and showing you how they have all merged and showing you back then we didn't exactly know when I did this. I didn't know a first seal or a second seal at that particular junction. I just knew that we're moving to the time that they would have to begin. And indeed they have. Now, I don't know about you, that you should find comfort in that. It's because God says He's going to tell us before He does it. So indeed, the march, the path that He's put our church on is walking us step by step through the journey. And you're going to see that today. So now, when I showed that, we went back through, we began talking about in that sermon, the seals. We laid a foundation of what the seals were and how God laid them out. We asked the question, what are they? Have they begun? Does the Bible give us any way to determine if they have been begun? And then we went through and we began to ask the questions. We brought out how God had brought us through transitioning to the next 7 years. Then we eventually get into COP 27, showing how that event, in fact, the COP 28 just took place. I'll talk about it in News and Nuggets next week, but of all places, in Dubai, the UAE, all the oil companies coming together to show how they're going to do away with oil? Really? Yeah. That's like me going to a lose weight convention. And I'm the chairman. You see, it doesn't make any sense. But the world's buying this lock, stock, and barrel, and it's spending trillions of dollars and destroying countries and the wealth of nations because it has nothing to do with God. And indeed, the COP 27 showed that the Pope had came in and actually turned it from a civil or a business-oriented venture to a religious ceremony of planet Earth. And then we went into talking about part 2, and we brought in that on the heels of all of this would come war, which would be the second seal. We did all of that in December 2022. Excuse me. So now we can look back in a year since that time, coming into 2024, and saying, indeed, all these events took place. Where God had pointed us to. Why? Because of this. How do we know what's coming? How do we know that like last year, we told everybody, get ready for the economic problem, get ready for inflation going up, interest rates going up, prices of homes beginning to fall. We said all that last year. How do we know that? Because of this. And how do we know that? Because God laid us out the macro and the mini periods of time. And I'm going to show you all that today that's coming in. So back in April and May, we brought out part 1 of the series that I'm bringing today. It's called The Coming Economic Woes, the First Year of Lean, and talked about the events we were in then and what was going to probably happen last year, and indeed they have. And I wanted to show that today. And the reason I wanted to show this sermon today is because of where we are. Because, see, you have just begun, you're 2 months into the second year of lean. And so we're talking about expanding the economic woes in the second year of lean. How do we know that? Again, through the prophecies of what God laid out for us, understanding the former and the latter, understanding what Joseph went through in his lean years and where we are today. And that's why I keep hitting on this back over and over and over, because you need to get this in your mind. You need to understand it's not important to know how far you've got. It's understanding where you are today. If you have confidence in where you are today, you'll be confident in the trust that you are in Jesus Christ's protection, in his welfare, and in his safety. Why? Because you will draw closer to him when you are today. So now, what does it mean, expanding the second year of lean? Let's go through that. The first of the lean years, God woven through his scriptures, God gives us the roadmap to understand the lean years. Now, we began putting that out last year. In fact, I think in the Bible study, Bobby was telling me y'all were studying the Shemitah cycle. I don't know which one you were into. But in that Shemitah cycle that we brought from the Feast of Tabernacles, not this year, but last year, we laid out all those patterns in the sevens in the way that God did. All right, so that gives us the roadmap. The macro is the bigger picture. Now, the Church of God at large have always had a pretty good grasp of the macro. The 6,000-year plan, the 7,000 year with the millennium, the return of Christ, the second resurrection. The church has always understood that. That was brought in vividly, and it was drilled in everybody's head for decades. But what they didn't have, because it wasn't the time yet, is the micro. They did not have the micro of the beginning of the final stages of the macro. It just wasn't time. They would not have understood it because they wouldn't have seen the events taking place today. The characters who's involved, the nations that are involved, how the events are unfolding. It would have not made any sense to them back 80 years ago for what's taking place today. No difference than when God gave John on the Isle of Patmos the book of Revelation. He only wrote down what he thought he understood. And that's why you have to go discern through that from the other prophets in the Old Testament to be able to give the explanation to it all. What I'm sharing with you today in the micro, you will not find in the history books of the Church of God in the previous generations. They're just not there. The micro, not the macro. But we get the micro because we understood the macro. Without understanding the larger plan, you can't understand how God applies it in the day-to-day at the end time. So now, here's the macro. From creation, God planned for mankind 7,000 years. At the end of the 4,000th year, or in the fourth day of the 7-week, 7-day, 7,000-year plan, Jesus Christ came the first time. Pretty much everybody understands that. Protestant churches understand that. Even the Catholic understands Jesus Christ came about 2,000 years ago. And as far as history and recording of the Bible, that was 4,000 years of mankind. But he also says he's coming back a second time. In the bigger picture, we understand that that would take place at the 6,000 years. Now, anybody who understands the plan of 7,000 years, you would understand you have 2,000 years from Jesus Christ's first coming to the second. That puts you today. So somewhere today, we talk about Christ coming. When I say today, I don't mean this day. I mean in this period of time, somewhere around 2030, 2,000 years after the death of Christ. All right, so we see all that. Hosea actually talks about that. Hosea 6 verse 2 says, after 2 days, he will revive us. Why would it say he will revive us? Well, when you look at Revelation and you look at Daniel and you look at the prophecies, you understand the seals, it's going to take a revival to stand mankind back up on his feet to get them ready to go, because it's going to be the worst time that mankind has ever been through. All right, so then it says, after 2 days, understanding the day is 1,000 years. Now, most people can understand a day is 1,000 years. The Bible talks about that. It gives you several examples. Well, 2 days would be 2,000 years. And so when you put the 2,000 years, you come to the period somewhere around 2030, 31. Now, I put the two up here because somewhere at 2030 or 3031, the church has always taught that Christ was crucified in 31 AD. Most other churches teach 30 AD. And there is a case to be made for 30 AD, specifically because there's no recording of a major earthquake at the time of Christ's crucifixion in 31 AD. But there is a major one recorded about that time in 30 AD. Both of those days have the crucifixion of the 14th fallen on a Wednesday, which is the fourth day. And so it's open. And I kind of believe that God did that on purpose, because he doesn't want us to know the day or the hour, just the season. That's why it's important to understand when you start, let God do the finishing. You just want to be there when he does. All right, so there we are. And then it goes on in verse 2. It says, and in the third day, at the beginning of the 3,000th year, which is the millennial reign, he says, he will rise us up and we shall live in his sight. So now let me ask you, when is the only time the Bible tells us we're going to live in Jesus' sight on this earth? The millennium. I mean, so there are churches of God who predict, who are now saying that Hosea 6:2 doesn't mean this. It only means back then, because it refers to Hosea 5, which it does. But that is the former, and this is the latter. And until churches can grasp, God has showed us the former so we can understand the latter, they will miss the micro of God's plan. This is pretty simple. There's nothing complicated when you do this. That's the macro. The church has always understood this. What they didn't understand was Hosea 6:2. In fact, some of them still don't, and they refuse to accept it. Now, taking that, let's go a little further now. Being confident that God is true to his word. Anybody doubt that? Of course not. We wouldn't be here if we doubted that. I mean, everybody who's tuning in, I'm sure all of you are confident that God is true to his word. So if he is, let's take a look at the next scripture. Amos 3, verse 7. Surely God will do nothing but he reveals the secret to his servants, the prophets. Do we believe that? Well, if you don't believe that, then you don't believe God is true to his word, because Amos 3:7 says he does. That means in the micro, in the final period of time before God opens the seal, when he opens the second seal, he's telling us to be ready because it's coming. He's telling us in advance. That's not complicated either. You know what's complicated? Accepting the fact that we're not living in days of prophecy anymore. You're living where prophecy has become news. You're now living in the here and now. And what we have to wrap our minds around is the fact of this, is that what God says is going to happen at the end time is happening right before you. That's hard to grasp, but it is happening right before you. We are moving now into what the Bible calls desperate times. Unlike any time in history, with the understanding that God is giving us, we can embrace these times with the confidence, with boldness, and all humility. Look what Peter says in 2 Peter 3, verse 9. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Let's go back to the top of the slide. Is God true to his word? Yes. Then he's telling us he's not willing that you would have to suffer and die. He wants us all to come to repentance and accept him before his coming. Again, it's simple. Isn't it simple when you think about it this way? I know my charts, my graphs, and all those things get complicated from time to time, and you don't have to understand them all. Honestly, you don't have to understand them all. But I think what God's done for us is important, is he has to have a record that he showed us in advance. And I believe God has given us a responsibility to lay these things out so that when someone says, you never told us, God will open up the pages and he says, look, it's right there, it's in the Bible. And they were teaching it. And you didn't listen. One of the things I was talking with Bobby Weber again before services today, I read an article, I won't go into the article, but it was a denial of a scripture in Zephaniah, that it means Zephaniah has nothing to do with the end time for us today. And I couldn't believe what I was reading, and it broke my heart. And I went to God and I was praying about it, and I talked to Audrey about it. I said, how can they basically say that? So another gentleman who was writing about that article, showing that it does have something to do with us. And then he went off on another tangent on something else. The reason that almost every one of the larger churches of God in our community, which is our family, believe it or not, because I've been in this church for over 50 years. Bobby was at 55 years. If Jerry is here, he'd be somewhere around 55 years. In other words, this is our heritage. Remember Paul, when he talked about the Jews, he said, I'd do anything to help, if I could help save his nation. Well, you kind of feel that way about our church, our heritage, and where we came from. And you see it's like it's being denied. And the denial comes from, until they can accept that God has put signs in the heavens, they will not understand the day they live in. They will have the macro. They will never understand the day-to-day as God's laying out for his people today. They're still sitting back waiting for an event that takes place that's going to bring us to Jacob's trouble, that's going to bring them somewhere to a place of safety, and then they'll be fine. But what if that doesn't happen to them? Because there's enough information in the Bible that says that's not going to happen. And then you got to get into, like this gentleman today, is you got to be in his church if you expect to go. What arrogance. The ego arrogance of something like that God's using me and only me, so if you're going to go to a place of safety, God, you're going to have to come to my church. And I don't want to even mention his name here because that's not what my point here. My point is to understand what God's telling us, because I can't believe what I'm seeing. And it all boils down to, because Mr. Herbert never taught the heavenly signs. They have denied God's word. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm not judging them. I'm telling you a fact what goes on. Because they tell you blood moon tetrads, all the signs in the heavens, the eclipses mean nothing. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, Genesis 1 says they do. God says, I put them there. First thing he put them there for is for a sign for his people. If you deny that, you are denying the very only thing, the very fact that God's using to tell us you're in that time. And then it brings you to the events. I don't know how to get that across to people. Maybe you can help me. Time will say that people will begin to pick it up. I don't know. All right, now I want to move. I got to move quicker. 2 Peter 3, verse 11 to 12. Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you be in all holy conversation and godliness? Looking for and hasting unto the coming of the day of the Lord. What has God been showing us in advance of all this? All right, so this is where we're going. We know that. Everybody's got that. So God says he's going to tell us before he does it. So what's he showing us? So now I want to get into putting together many of the things in the cycles that we have. I'm not going to go deep into it because I want to get into some of the events taking place today to show you where we are. All right, just prior to the Feast of Tabernacles, we moved into the new Shemitah cycle. And the Shemitahs being God's appointed countdown. All right, the Shemitah, God's countdown to the appointed time. It tells us as we're getting closer and closer to the end of time, the end of age, or the time of the return of Jesus Christ. We see that from the Shemitahs. We know that from Noah and 120 cycles and the 50 and the Jubilees. All those things all tie together. That gives us the macro, which brings us to understanding the events. We went into the doomsday clock, shows you the conditions at the time when all these things begin to happen. The next thing is 2023 we went into, showing the year of transition. And boy, it has been a year of transition, tracking the conditions from plenty to lean. Anybody financially kind of better off than you were at the beginning of the year? No. It's, the rich people are. The rich people have gotten richer. And it's becoming a great divide now between middle and low class, and everybody's getting into the lower class, and the rich have become richer and richer. Have you noticed how great the stock market's doing right now? Yeah. They are totally disconnected from the rest of the world. And they're controlling where the money goes to and flow. It's like having COP28, how you're going to get rid of oil and become away from that kind of a base in the oil countries. And them being in charge. And they caught them. They caught them setting up meetings on how they're going to make oil deals with the other nations while they're at COP28 telling them how to get rid of oil. They caught them. So everybody's denying it now. Oh, no, we weren't going to do that. Well, they got written documentation of it. Bunch of hypocrites. Well, they fly in with their jets and they live in these 5-star special hotels and burning fossil fuels like you and I can never even have enough money to even fuel our own homes. Telling us how you have to do without. Hypocrites. Well, Jesus Christ is going to set that straight. We don't have to worry. Jesus is going to do that. Then we went into approaching our waters of Marah, which I believe is probably the most important of all the series for us on a day-to-day. The waters of Marah open up what I'm going to be showing you in the next sermon that I've been trying to get to, which I won't start until the first Sabbath in 2024. The rise and fall of America. And it didn't hit me till this week. And as I've been studying, trying to get to it, I didn't have enough of the pieces of the puzzle until this week, is that it's for 2024. It wasn't for 2023, that sermon. And so as I've been trying to get to it, I couldn't get to it. Well, now everything's starting to fall in place. And so I can pretty much, unless something else changes, the first Sabbath in 2024, God willing, I plan on delivering that sermon. And you're going to have to put on your thinking caps because there's a lot of information you're going to learn. Because I'm learning it myself, putting it all together. It's very, very important. So now, the waters of Marah, as I was saying, that next sermon that I'm going to bring in ties in the day-to-day, going into next year, how important that is to us. So what's is important in the waters of Marah, we need to understand that journey. The journey you're on day to day, week to week, month by month, and bringing us to the return of Jesus Christ. And by understanding the journey, you have to understand the process that God's using. It is in that process that God's using is how we find the appointed times. See, in other words, God has got, I tell you, I feel so silly when I think back in 2020 when I said God didn't have very much written for us for the last decade. My goodness, they got so much there, it's just unbelievable. The difference was we just didn't know it yet. No, he hadn't revealed it to us yet. It wasn't understood. And now there's so much information, you don't have time to bring it all out. And the Bible never changed. Isn't that wonderful how God can just bring out stuff that he's got hidden from thousands of years ago, that he gave that information to this prophet, and he gave the information to this prophet and to this one. And he brings all those things together, and they all lie to the same thing at the very end, and how they all connect. And he was giving out these little breadcrumbs for thousands of years through his people. It's amazing when you think about it. I was talking about Miss Pattis, says, I can't wait to sit in a Bible study with Jesus Christ in the millennium. Won't that be fascinating? Think about it. You get invited to Jerusalem, and Jesus says, all right, everybody grab your seats. And he goes to work. Man, I got chills just thinking about that. Can you imagine that, learning from Jesus himself? Wow. Anyway, that's a sidetrack. All right, so now let's get on. So now let's look at the micro. All right, so here's our years from 23 and 24 and where we're at. We got into the 2030 and 31 AD right up in here. We're at this cycle that we're into right now. So now we need to understand how this applies to Joseph's lean years, right? Now we covered that, so let's go through that. I won't spend a lot of time here, but let's cover that. It's amazing how God laid out in Genesis how the 7 years are broken into an end-time understanding, just like he gave them back then. So as we went through that, we understood that the first 2 years, according to Genesis 42 and 43, is that the famine began and people didn't have food. So they were running short of food. So they were going to Egypt and they were buying food. The second year, things got worse. Prices kept going up. They told us inflation was gone. Bidenomics has kicked in and everybody's doing great. Has your food prices going down a lot? Or are they still going up? Oh yeah, they're still going up. Other things have come down. The cycles of bringing things back and forth have gone down. But why isn't food going down? Because of this. That's why we tell you, put your storage away. Whatever you can store, and just keep recycling it. All right, when you can pick it up. If you go back and buy something today that you stored from last year, check the price. You're going to be shocked. When you find a sale, pick it up. Run to the store and grab it before it's gone. All right, the third year. The third year in Joseph's time, the livestock and ways of making a living began to disappear. So what is that telling us? Well, if we're looking at society we live today, you can begin to see people losing jobs. You begin to see businesses closing down. You begin to see, how about your banking system, the financial system beginning to collapse? I'm going to show you a lot of that today. Well, some of that, not a lot. In the fourth year, people began to have to sell their lands and themselves. So when you look at today, you want to be in a position that as we go through, I'm going to pull another side of this in just a couple minutes, so I don't want to go into it too much. But you want to be wherever God, where do you want to be when the time of tribulation comes? Well, we would all like to be in a place of safety, but we know you want to be in Christ's hand. But where do you want to be? If you had your choice, do you want to be in the city? Do you want to be in Chicago or New York? How about Philadelphia? How about California with all the drug going on and the drinking, and get your feces map so you don't step on all the mess that's all over the city? In other words, you see what I mean? It's like, where do you want to position yourself if you have a choice? Because see, right now you got a choice. You're only in the beginning of two. You got a couple years to go. All right, so now, then you got the last 3 years. By the last 3 years in America, if you're waiting to do something, it might be really tough by the last 3 years, because that's kind of Jacob's trouble. That's when the rest of the world comes crashing down on America. Jacob's trouble. And the other Israelite nations too, by the way. Those are your first 2 years. And in the first 2 years, we see in Genesis 42 and 43, primarily what you focused on. Why do we focus on these areas and now there's nothing else? Because that's what they focused on back then. That's why we talked about food. We will be talking about what in the future? Water. Why did I talk about water yet? Because that wasn't the problem yet on water. They still had water, even though it was a drought. But the rivers began drying up. Then they couldn't feed their cattle. They couldn't survive. So you see how things progress? So if you can understand the process, then you begin to understand how it's going to work in our day and time. And you position yourself. Now, here's what I was talking about the seals. When I did this one a couple years ago, a year and a half ago now, I didn't know about when the seals would be. I do not take liberty to tell you what is happening if I don't know. I prefer to just tell you I don't know. It's a lot safer that way. And frankly, it's a lot more honest too. If you don't know, you don't know. I mean, trying to guess or try to force something to fit, that is so dangerous, especially if you're trying to teach somebody. Because they live on what you're saying and thinking that that's fact if you're saying it. Otherwise, you're lying to them. So I didn't know back then. So there's our Genesis 42 and Genesis 43, where we are coming into. And I got it in 2024, right, because it picks up at the end of 23 and carries into 24, because you're going from atonement to atonement. So the second year carries into 2024. So when you look at them, always remember you're always carrying into the next. Starts 1 year, finishes into the next year. And of course, there's the scriptures again. We brought them in. And this was, again, is like duplicating, but actually what I've done here is I've actually brought in another series. But the series, see, they all connect and all tie in together. And they're all saying the same thing. And there's in Genesis 45, so these 2 years, they had been famine, and they're yet 5 years at the end of the second year. And so for us, when we reach atonement in 2024, you still have 5 years. 5 years. That's what Genesis shows us if we're in the cycles that we are today. So then in the 5 years, you have all lining up, bringing us to 2029. So there's our 7-year cycle all the way through, and we're still connected. Everything's still online, saying the same thing. You see how I moved the seals back and forth? Because when we gave this one out, we didn't know exactly when they would be. So if you look at a later series we just finished, you'll see I got one and I got 2 separated off of these. I don't know when 3 begins, or 4 or 5. So where we're at. And that's only being honest with y'all, because I don't know. So then you get to 47. So now it brings in one more thing as we were going through the series. It brings out another point in Genesis 47. Here's what we learned in Genesis 47. The first 2 years, Israel was still in Israel. The second 2 years, Jacob came to Egypt at the end of the second year. They went to buy the food and eventually so. So here's what I'm saying. This is where you are now. The next 2 years is where you should begin to find where do you want to be for the last 3. Do you want to stay where you are today? Are you happy in the house you're in the neighborhood you're in? Do you feel safe? Are you comfortable? Maybe you want to move closer to a family member. I don't know. I'm just saying, I'm trying to get you your thinking caps on. If indeed this is where they are, and then if God doesn't come here, well, then you're still where you want to be anyway. You haven't lost anything. See what I mean? In other words, through the process, you begin to plan where you're going to be. Best position you when things get really bad. That's only common sense. It's only common sense. So then you got by the 5th year that the famine and bondage all across the land. So we began to show all those things we brought out earlier, which I just talked about, so I don't need to go through those again. What we didn't have previously was this connection. That connection came in later. It was always written there, but I didn't see it. And when I saw it, it opened up another pathway through to the end time. And as we do that, we go through the process. So here we are, first, second, and now the second year begins to make way for the 3rd year. So you begin to see this coming year as food continues, and I was studying the food thing, and they're not being honest with food right now because they're still predicting food shortages, getting bigger. So you'll begin to see things next year beginning to lay the foundation this year. The shadow portrays the real thing. So what happened is famine, pestilence. And so what are we beginning to see now? We're beginning to see a new round of pestilence showing up. In China, in several other countries, here in America, there's lung disease. They call it white lung for children now. All of these things, the bird flu rising again, all these things keep adding to what's coming. You begin to see more and more of that toward the end of this year, because this year begins to lay out what's for next year. Now, in Joseph's day, they were an agrarian society, and we understand the famine in Joseph's day progressed to the transition. Everything went to Egypt. In our understanding, we understand everything's going to go to Babylon, the beast power. They're going to control everything. You can't buy or sell. So if you can understand that, you understand today. And God will lead you to where you will be. So here's some suggestions for questions you want to ask yourself. 1, if you still have a job or you need a job, if I lose my job in 2024 or 25, how will I stand? Where will you be? Can you pay your house note? Or if you can't, are you going to be kicked out? And they will kick you out. And they will sell that house. And in the future, as U.S. debt becomes so staggering, the government will begin to cut Social Security and your benefits. How will you stand? If the government begins rationing food and utilities, how will I, and you can go and fill it out. And if medicines and medical are not available, how are you going to be? These are real questions you need to ask yourself now. You can't wait till it's too late. You can't wait to say, well, God's going to take care of me in a place of safety somewhere. And he could. I'm not saying he can't. But what I'm saying is the Bible doesn't show that. And the way the church is positioned now with so many churches scattered everywhere, I don't know how would God do that. He can do anything he wants to do, but you're going to have all those leaders of all these churches all saying, no, God's using me, and it's going to be one hellacious mess. I guarantee you that much. So what can we learn in Joseph's lean years? Primarily, it shows us how the deterioration of the world around Egypt takes place in just 7 years. People say today in prophecy, and the churches will tell you, well, you know, we don't have the 2 witnesses yet. We don't have this. We don't have that. How can that all take place in such a short span of time? Well, in Joseph's day, it happened in 7 years. And I'm saying it can happen like that overnight here. 2, it shows the process of the deterioration so we can understand today. The process of deterioration takes 2 forms. 1, the current conditions are short-term, your current conditions, and the future conditions are long-term and understand what's coming. All that's laid out from Joseph's lean years. 3, it provides biblical guidance and protection for our day. If you can live within those scriptures and understand what's coming, you will position yourself on how to do that. Joshua 3 says one of the ways to learn about this, and they commanded the people, saying, when you see the ark of the covenant, your Lord, your God, then you shall remove from your place and go after it. So what is God showing you today? Is he showing you how to protect yourself and what you need to be doing? Then you better do it, because that's where God is taking you. Each person has a different way how to approach that. Different places in different parts of the country, people who live by themselves, people who are young versus people who are old, people who have children and grandchildren that they're taking care of. Every person needs to go to God and say, God, how do I position to lean on you to be able to prepare for what's coming? And God will show you. And when you see it, you better follow it. Because if you don't, then you take the price of whatever comes if you don't. 4, that you may know by which way you must go, for you have not passed this way heretofore. Notice, we've never been to where we are today. We're going out there with the Joseph Project, and God willing, if we ever get to stage 3, which I pray we will, the goal is to hopefully that some people will want to be able to sell their homes and set up a homestead close to other brethren. Do you want to be rather with God's people, or do you want to be in the city? Now, we're going to lay out a foundation on how to do it. I'm going to tell you the truth. I don't know how to do that yet. I know it can't be a commune. I know, and it can't be Jim Jones' way. There can't be one man in charge. I cannot make myself in charge of anything. I look at the New Testament. They tried to do that once, and they all had everything in common, remember? And that went horribly bad. It did. Fighting, bickering, in-house. There's only one way to do it. Each person has to have their own piece of land, big or small, whatever you can afford, and you be in charge of your own destiny with Jesus Christ. Nobody telling you how you are to live your personal life. That's between you and God. That's the only way it can work. Now, how do we accomplish that? Well, we're going to get a group of people together, and we're going to have a team and see how do we do that. And you know what? God's going to show us how to do that. I do not believe he's brought us this far to be able to give us what he's given and not be able to do and care for God's people. I don't believe that for a second. And it just means a lot more work that's coming. And for the first time, the churches are not going to be building massive headquarters. This is going to be building how we protect God's people. That's what we're doing. And we're going to start working on that right away. Going on. All right, so now, a time of great deception, the end of days, God's warnings, Deuteronomy 31, said, so that Moses commanded the Levites which bear the ark of the covenant, saying, take the book of the law and put it on the side of the ark in the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may there for a witness to the people. What's the first thing you do? You take the word of God and you put it where everybody can see it. And where is it? They're looking at the throne of God. That's where you start. You put your mind on God's holy word and on him. So that whenever they went anywhere, what was the thing they saw? They saw God first, they saw his holy word second, and everything else came after that. Not complicated, huh? And we just need to do that. 29. For I know that after my death will utterly corrupt yourselves, turning aside from the way that I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days. So what are we looking at today? The latter days. And we're seeing evil just coming all over the land of Israel. Across the world, everywhere you look. The 3 specific areas of which to watch for in Joseph's lean years. 1, the weather, droughts, floods, fires, catastrophes, famines, pestilences. And we're going to be covering more and more of these. We use the time for news and nuggets, so I don't have to take all the sermon time for those things, because there's so much of it. 2, wars, massive deaths due to war, adding to all of the above. And 3, governments. You're going to watch governments toppling government after government, and eventually there becomes a one world governance. And I use governance because I don't think there'll be one government. I think they'll have all governance, all given their government control and authority to one authority. The Bible actually justifies that. Anger growing growing anger according to economic conditions steadily deteriorate all around the world. And now we're seeing that. It's kind of petered off just a little bit, but don't let that fool you because it is getting worse. The age of global protests. We're in the early stages. Now, I'm going to go through a stage here. I'm just going to kind of read headlines because I covered a lot of this already, and I think you're with me on this. So what we're going to see is global protests growing as things continue to go on. What have we seen since the war? Whoa, protests all over the place. And surprisingly, it's all against Israel. The United States just said yesterday that they will not support Israel if they continue the manner of which they attacked Gaza in the northern part of Gaza, if they continue that in the south. So how do you stop them? How does the United States have the right to tell Israel you can't defend yourself the way you can? But the whole world now is coming down on Israel. And we said just a few weeks ago that this would be the beginning of what leads to armies surrounding Jerusalem. Because Israel says, we're not stopping. And they just basically told America, then you go your way, we'll go ours. Pretty much that's what just happened yesterday. This was 2 years ago. We talked about the coming economic hurricane that was coming our way. Remember that? You might remember that. We covered that several times. I don't have to go into detail here. Tightening money policy, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He said that hurricane, is right down, and it's down the road. It's coming our way. It's a lot closer than it was when he said that. And we don't know if it's a minor or superstorm, Sandy. He said, but you better brace yourself. And sure enough, we're at that stage right now. The beginning of this year, in 2023, they said the banking collapse of 2023 was bigger than 2008. All right, said this was the calm before the storm. That was the headlines. There was 3 banks that were collectively fell. It was the Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic. Those 3 banks, the global amount of revenue of those 3 banks was bigger than all the banks that was in 2008 fell. Boom. That was at the beginning of the year. When we said that this was actually just the beginning. They expected 8 more that year to collapse, and that was this year. Did 8 more collapse? No, actually, there was a whole lot more than 8. A whole lot more. And I'll tell you what I was praying about. I knew we had the funds in the bank account for the property we're getting ready to buy, and I honestly was praying God would hold that off because you only are insured up to $250,000. So if anybody's got more than $250,000 cash in the bank, you need to move to another bank for some of it because you don't get your money back if that bank collapses. You might, but chances are you won't. They only insured up to $250,000. And we had the money sitting in that bank waiting to transfer and they kept putting off the closing date, getting ready to buy the property. They said if the banks collapsed before, then that money's gone. So I was praying that God would hold them banks off till we got the land secured. You know, I was praying about that. So here we have J.P. Morgan Bank. This is just recently. It said 159 branches are going to be closing this year. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citibank announced the same similar scale closing in 2024, this coming year. Many banks have no choice right now. The banks are sitting on absolute colossal mountain of unrealized losses. In other words, there's losses sitting in the banks they can't close out right now because they'll shut the bank accounts. Just 1 week, just a week or so ago, in November, the bank submitted filings to permanently close another 64 branches in 1 week. 64 branches. In addition to the bank closures, thousands of employees are losing their jobs, and it's uncertain what may lead to the bank's rush of their withdrawal. Now take a look at this chart. Realized gains and unrealized of the banks and their securities. The little box I just circled up there was 2008, and that running the banks back then. They were running out of money. Remember what happened? It was a nightmare. They thought the whole system was coming down. See how little the red is? Then we began to see that in 2017. Why do you think Donald Trump got in? I mean, most people didn't even like him. You know, he had his constituents, I understand that. They saw this was coming. And they knew the same people were handling this would be in if they came here. And that would have magnified this. They knew they had to turn things around a little bit and take whatever they did like and take it. But look what happened right after that. The situations of the banks in the financial picture. But now look where we are today. Look at where we are today versus 2008. If the banks close this out, you will shut down this world. the whole world will shut down. So can this happen? Can it happen in 7 years? Absolutely. The Bible says in one day. When this happens, you're going to go to the bank to get your money and the doors are going to be shut. So they're all positioning themselves now. They're cutting their costs because they ain't got no money. Yeah, they got money sitting there, but it's not theirs anymore. Why? Because they're sitting on this. So they don't have enough equity to cover this. That's the hurricane that's coming, that's out there. Will it happen next year? I don't think so. I think that's going to happen, according to Joseph, 25 and 26. So position yourself to know that. All right, let's go on. The unrealized losses in the treasuries and the government. In 1 quarter, the treasuries lost $126 billion. In just 1 quarter, it was up 22%. To $684 billion this year in losses. And how many people are telling you this? Nobody. This is according to their own records that are out there. The banking collapse of 23 is now officially bigger than it was in 2008. Charlie Munger, by the way, who brought this out, he died just the other day. He was 99 years old, and he was Warren Buffett's sidekick. They began that mega fund many years ago. He said the lot of real estate isn't good anymore. He said there's troubled shopping centers, troubled properties. He said there's a lot of agony out there. When he said this earlier in the year, mortgages were already up to 6%. Now they went to 8%. 8%. Unbelievable, but it's true. More than 2,100 stores are closed. Oh, that was earlier in the year. Now we're at 2,800 stores have closed. Some are never going to open again, going through. So you see, and it says in the news report, it says, we have never seen anything like this before. What's coming? All of this is all lining up. Mind you, the stock market just keeps running up. Running up. So they said if the people are going to act this way with all of these riots and the breaking of stores, how are they going to act when things are in the green? Shoplifting every 10 minutes, you see another worker. You watch the security guards, they're just watching everybody. Just take everything out the store and they walk out. It's just like it's every day. Luke 23 says, but they cried saying, crucify him, crucify him. And Jesus said, for if they do these things in the green tree, what will be done in the dry? What happens when people get hungry? And they have to go steal for food because they're hungry. Well, they're not stealing, so they go online and sell everything that they're stealing. The Federal Reserve now is admitting that more than a million Americans could lose their jobs by the end of 2024. I'm going to go through it because I don't want to read all this now. They expect the unemployment to go up to another 4.6% of another million people by next year. The global food crisis now, 10 countries suffering the most from hunger. They expect next year to be worse than this year. Nearly 350 million people around the world are experiencing the most extreme forms of hunger, and nearly 49 million are on the brink of famine. That was at the beginning of this year. 2024 will be worse. Farmers are facing serious hardships that have not gotten any better. The Oklahoma farmer says that their Dust Bowl, well, they've gotten some relief. So they're going to try again next year, but they think the drought's going to continue and they could lose everything that they plan again. So you see this drought in the Midwest. If you look at Louisiana and Mississippi right now, it looks like this. All the dark reds when we drive out in the country, see all these ponds, they're just sitting on their bottoms now over there. So I won't cover that. So look at this. The middle class and the poor are being devastated. You know, when you look at amid the financial sector, turmoil, high inflation, the effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and 3 years of COVID, we're moving closer and closer to a Revelation 6:6 scenario. So I heard a voice in the 4 beasts saying, a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see that you hurt not the oil or the wine. The rest of the world is going to take a beating before it hits here in America. So you need to be prepared. If you can still go to the store, don't think it's getting better if you got food, because it's not. You are in the calm before the storm. You're at the beginning of the next 6 years in this cycle. You're in the 2nd year. We have got a long way to go. Not a lot of time. So 3 things we need to be doing while we transition through the next few years. 3 things. You want to put this on in your notes, in your head, and put on your calendar. 1, determine to count the cost. Count the cost. In other words, if you know this is coming, you have to count the cost of what it's going to take for you to get to the return of Jesus Christ. That means whatever it takes, you're going to be there. You're going to follow God. Luke 14, for which of you intending to build a tower sits not down first to count the cost, whether you have sufficient to finish it. Lest happily after he had laid the foundation, he is not able to finish it. And behold, those that begin to mock him. So likewise, whoever he be of you that forsakes not all that he has cannot be my disciple. What Jesus is telling you, and count the cost, whatever you have in your house, you need to be willing, just let it go. You can't take it into the kingdom with you anyway. What are you going to do with it? All those belongings. I mean, what are they going to do for you? When you realize that, what can they take away from you? There's nothing they can take away from you. You're willing to give it up already. 2, the next thing you need to determine to be confident. You can't live in fear. God's telling you all these things. He's not telling you to scare you. He's trying to get you to realize the facts of what's coming and to face it head on. Be prepared. You're in Jesus' protection. He's not going to let anything happen to you that he does not want you to go through. You need to understand that. So that when you're there and you're going through it, you ain't going to sit down and say, why is God let me go through all of this? That's not the right question. The right thing is, Father, help me get through this. I knew I would be here if you didn't let me. In other words, nothing can happen to you unless Christ lets it. Resolve that fact and you'll be fine. If he resolves that you be a martyr, then take it. And that's hard to believe, but that's, for almost 50 years, I tried to figure out how did the disciples, when they were beaten, go out praising God? Remember, they put him in prison, they hung him out to dry, they beat him, and said, now you don't go out there. And they went out there praising God, singing songs. I said, man, I never got to that stage yet. I'm not going to tell you that I'm there yet. But I'm telling you, I'm facing God and saying, listen, if I need to be there, please help me be there. I'm just being honest with you. I'm not one who's out there to go out there to be a sufferer a lot. That's not my lot in life. I like that fat, dumb, and happy approach, being out there lean and hurting, that's not my cup of tea. But if that's what it's going to be, then that's what it's going to be. Look at Hebrews. I will never leave or forsake you. Do we believe God's word? So that you may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear. What can man do to me? This is hard. When you read it, it sounds so simple. But when you come face to face with reality, sometimes it's hard. But that's what you have to do. You have to be confident. 3, determine to be content. That's an important one, to be content. You see, that's when the people, when they came out of Egypt, they were never content, no matter what happened. They were always fighting, always grumbling, complaining and griping. When God finally gave them food, they were so miserable, they ate so much they killed themselves. They literally ate themselves to death, some of them. I said, my goodness. Look at Hebrews 13. Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with what things you have, for he has said, I don't have the rest of the verse. Let me just finish up with that. Be confident with the things that you have, no matter what they are. It's not wrong to want something, but just don't lust after or go after something you don't have. If you can get something, then go get it. There's nothing wrong with that. Just don't lust after it. And don't gripe to God if you don't have it. Look at Ecclesiastes 5:10. He that loves silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loves abundance with increase. This is vanity. You ever notice rich people, they never have enough? I mean, how many houses can you have? How many cars can you own? How many boats can you be in at one time? It's when you're content with what you have, do you realize that you always have what you need? and you're at peace with that. All right, the example of the children of Israel, when I read this, it shocked me the first time I read this and understood it. For the children, the Lord of God blessed you in all your works. He knows you walking through in the great wilderness. For these 40 years, the Lord, your God, has been with you, and you lack nothing. When I first realized what I was reading, and I understood they were in the desert, and they were griping because they didn't have food, they didn't have water at certain times, they wore the same shoes for 40 years, and God says, you lack nothing. It showed me something, that I was not prepared for the future. Because I'm looking at my house, and I looked around my house and said, I don't have hardly a wall available that I can't stick something next to. In other words, I had couches, chairs, TV. You know, how's your house? Is it filled with stuff? Remember the sermon I gave years ago called Stuff? We got stuff. They didn't. And God said they were ungrateful. It's hard to change our mindset, but I'm telling you, if you're not there, you need to change your mindset. And God will help you. You will realize where you're going is much better than where you are. That's what you have to focus on. Paul's example of being content, he says in the Greek, it's the word 842 means sufficient, adequate, needing no assistance. In Philippians 4, he says, not that I speak of respect of want, for I have learned that whatever state I am, therewith to be content. Now, I think about that in the summertime when the air conditioner goes out. I'm not really content. You see what I mean? Your state of mind. What are you in when you find that state of mind? God says you have to be content. You deal with it. That's where it's at. You get it fixed and you're fine. But you have to deal with it being content. And in conclusion, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is an example that we all need to keep in our minds, the example of these young men. They determined to count the cost. Daniel 3, verse 16, and you're shaking your head, you know the example. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and answered to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. They were staring a fiery furnace right in front of them. And they stared down that king, so that whether God will save us or not, we will not worship you. That is the ultimate, where God wants us to be. So I asked you a question earlier. In the next couple years, when we get to those final three, where do you want to be? Well, see, that answer has two answers. It is a physical answer where you can place yourself, that God will protect you, but more importantly, where God will place you in his protection is the second answer. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is a lesson for all of us as we enter into our second year of lean.